U14-L6 Diary of a War Nurse Reading. Intro. In May of 1917, U.S. medical teams became the first American troops to arrive in the European war zone. Helen Dorr Boylston served in France with the 1st Harvard Unit, a U.S. medical team that treated more casualties than any other group of American doctors and nurses during the conflict. In 1927, she published Sister, the War Diary of a Nurse, an account of her experiences in the field. The following excerpt spans from February to November of 1918. February 23rd. Glorious day out. Spring comes so early here. Already the line of the hills against the sky is green, and Jock the camp gardener is plowing in the quadrangle. 200 gas cases came down last night, poor wretched things, and we had no beds for them, had to put stretchers on the floor, and they were so uncomplaining about it. One said to me as I was bathing his eyes while he laid on the floor, "It's jolly good to be here, sister." February 28th. The first thing I heard when I went into the war this morning was Hilly playing White Wings on the gramophone. I don't believe he's had that record off since I was here before. I had the same side of the ward that I had before, with nearly all the same patients, 40 of them, but it isn't as easy as it sounds, for the dressings are hard. I'm so pleased to have that side again, but heavens, how I worked. My back is busted in two tonight, slowly down the ward, doing the dressings and making the beds. But every time I straightened up, there was old Dad beaming. The dear plucky old thing. It's quite an accomplishment to get old Dad to beam. He came all the way from Australia to fight for the England he had never seen. He is over 60, and no one can imagine how he got into the army. But he did, and now he lies here with his leg torn to pieces. He's a crotchety old darling, always raging and roaring about something. And then there is Hilly. His hip was shattered by an explosive bullet when he was crossing a river, and he would have drowned if his chum hadn't come back to him and carried him out on his back. There is more to it, but I'm not sure I'll ever get it straight. Anyway, Hilly's chum got the Victoria Cross for it, but Hilly, as he says, got nothing but a bum leg. He is an Irish guardsman, and everyone in the hospital knows him, long and thin, with a fine, keenly intelligent face, which is proudly decorated with a neat black mustache. He has lain for 9 months tied to a Balkan frame, and he is the hardest soul of A1. He bucks the boys up to no end, always singing or joking or wrangling about something. He never complains, though he is tortured daily. We have always been great friends. We had old jokes that we cherished and certain formulas of greeting and leave taking. It was Hilly long ago who started the boys saying good night to me, all in one voice. They think it was a great joke, but it's a lot more than that to me. I wondered tonight if they had forgotten. There were new boys in the ward, of course, and it had been a long time since I had been there. But when it came time for me to go off duty, I stepped in the doorway as usual and said good night to the boys near at hand. Like a flash, Hilly pulled himself up, his hand over hand along his frame, yelling, "Hey, mate, shout your noise, sister's going." There was a grinning silence while I said, and in a rather small voice, which I tried to keep from shaking, "Good night, lad, sleep well." With a crash that shook the hut, all the boys responded in one shout, "Good night, sister." The new boy stared. The sister in charge flew out of the office. "For God's sake, Bolston," she exclaimed, "what on earth are you doing?" "Nothing," I replied meekly, "just saying good night to the boys." "Well, for the love of Mike, I should think you were." March 8th. I haven't written in this lately because I've been too busy. There is a new crowd at the senior officers machine gun school, and they have nearly rushed the Harvard unit off its feet. It's a great fun because no matter how complicated things get, the men have to go back up the line at the end of the month. And next time they come down the line, if they ever do come, poor dears, they will be at some other base rushing other girls. I always have a curious sense of impersonality in these affairs. Officers come out of the line presumably for extra study, but mostly for the rest and good time. And they must have a girl or girls. They have seen enough of men for a while. So they fall enthusiastically in love with the first girl they meet, and everybody has a gorgeous time. But I wonder now and then if they ever really see us as individuals. I doubt it. Anyway, everybody's for every but he forgets everybody else as soon as they're gone, and that's awful. It's a fascinating game. This playing at love with people who can't stay long enough to be serious. One feels so safe. I'm getting to hate long drawn out affairs once in a while, of course. March 9th. The spring offense is on the way. The boys have all been recalled, and there is an unpleasant tension in the air. John left today. I was to have had a farewell luncheon with him this noon, but at the last minute, my off duty time was changed, and I couldn't go. He waited ages down at the lack, and then appeared in the doorway of the ward with an appropriately forlorn expression. He stayed about an hour, and we finally parted with all the necessary drama. He is the first of the crowd at the school to go, and thought of it makes me sick. The crowd at the school will all be killed. They always are. I don't see why we aren't all crazy. Maybe we are. We ought to be. And yet, after saying goodbye to John, both of us feeling miserable and tragic, I went off duty and went out to dinner with Kit and Jerry and Jordan and Len Von Stone and had the time of my life. I suppose that's why we aren't crazy. We can do things like that and keeps our balance. 4 a.m., March 24th. They've come. I've been working all night, just got off. Our first warning that the convoys were coming was a low drone of motors and the ambulances winding over the roads in the moonlight. As far as the eyes could see, they were coming. Just black beetles crawling, scarcely a yard between them, and not a light anywhere. It was about an hour after supper, and there was an air raid on. Not a very bad one, but our shells were coming over so low that our hair stood up at end with every screech. Ruth and I were standing outside the mess watching the air raid when, through the sound of whistling shells, we heard a low purring note that had nothing to do with the jerky growl of Gotha's German war airplanes. We exchanged a startled glance and started for the matron's office, neither of us saying a word. Just as we reached the administration hut, the first ambulance stopped in front of us, the others close behind, and we had to wait until the boys were taken out. Nearly every one should have been a stretcher case, ragged and dirty, tin hats still on, wounds patched together anyway, some not even covered. The boys' faces were white and drawn, and their eyes glassy from the lack of sleep. Some of them were not more than 16 or 17, and they stood, ghastly in pale light, waiting to be told where to go. There were great husky men crying with the pain of gaping wounds and dreadfully swollen, discolored trench feet, who sank down exhausted the moment they stopped. There were strings of from 8 to 20 blind boys filling up the road, clinging tightly and pitifully to each other's hands, and led by some bed-ragled, limping youngsters who could still see. Everyone had a cigarette in his mouth and another behind his ears, if he were so fortunate as to have an ear. As they grinned at us, grinned. Cheerio, sister. I got a bloody one this time. Over it all, the shells screamed, and the Gothas growled, and the searchlight swept the sky. Now and then a bomb exploded in the distance, and each time these poor devils jumped horribly, and they grinned again at sister. They were sickly things, those grins. Ruth and I stood beside the road with tears rolling down our cheeks, trying to grin back. I wonder if I'll ever be able to look at marching men anywhere again without seeing those blinded boys, with 5 or 6 wound strips on their sleeves, struggling painfully along the road. Matron sent us to the D lines, which were reserved for the walking wounded. She said there was only 500 in the convoy, but there were stretchers cases coming. If she sent Topsy Allen with us, did we think the three of us could clean up the 500 walkers? We thought we could. In the D line, we made a frantic effort to systemize our work. We had a small table for the medical officer, a large table piled with bandages, splints, boric ointment, sponges, and a basin of Dakin's solution for wet dressings. Then there were 2 smoky lanterns and an enfeeblable Primus stove. Ruth, armed with a pair of scissors, stood in the doorway of the dressing tent and beckoned the boys in 2 or 3 at a time, because there was so much to do. It was impossible to take the dried and stiffened bandages off carefully. The only way was to snatch them off with one desperate yank. Poor Ruth, her tender heart nearly broke. She'd cut the dressing down the middle, and the poor lad looked on with set jaw and imploring eyes. There'd be a quick jerk, a sharp scream from the lad, a faint sob from Ruth, and he was passed on to the medical officer, while Ruth began to the next. The medical officer looked at the wound, said wet, dry, boric ointment or splint. To the orderly at the table. The orderly scribbled the order on a bit of paper and gave it to the lad, who moved on to Topsy and me. They came much too fast for us, and within 15 minutes were standing 20 deep around the dressing table. As the hours went by, we ceased to think. Our hands moved automatically. We were hardly conscious and shuffling of feet in the steady drip of wounds, bleeding from surface vessels, torn open when Ruth took off the dressing. I remember hearing a soft thump now and then, and I suppose somebody fainted, but there was no time to look up. We were needed elsewhere for stretcher cases at the very moment. After a while, Topsy had to give it up and went away very white. She was sick before we started anyway. There, though now, just as the dawn is coming, I don't know whether I'm sleepy or not, but when I close my eyes, the bandages go on rolling and winding and staining crimson. The blur of faces is still there in the sputtery light, and I can hear this ceaseless shuffle of feet, so I'm riding in this until it goes away and I can sleep. August 19th. There are compensations after all. Tonight at about 9 o'clock, Betsy Lazenby and I borrowed bicycles and rode down through the village and around the beach road. A little half moon was just slipping over the sand dunes. In its faint light, our little village looked like a dainty little gingerbread town. Beyond the village, the mist was rising from the fields and drifting into tiny stretch of woods beyond. The air smelled of autumn, cool and with a sweet, damp, earthy smell mingled with whiffs of peat smoke. At the end of the road, the dunes lay black against the sky, but with a touch of gold along their edges. One felt that beyond that ridge of dunes lay that outermost rim of the world, the place where dreams are born. We went on until we heard the sea roaring, and three giant searchlights flashed out across the sky. Then we turned and went home again through the mists. Nothing is too much to bear when the world remains like this, though at all. September 5th. The Hindenburg Line was broken, a line of German soldiers in defenses, meaning the Allies were advancing against the Germany. Camp is wild with excitement. Perhaps this is the beginning of the end. And if it is, what then? I had forgotten that there might be an end, that someday I might go back to America. We got our first stretcher convoy in months yesterday. Since then, they had been coming in steadily. The boys were so worn out. This morning I arrived at one youngster's bedside, just in time to prevent a lively attack of hysteria. They came out of France younger and younger. This lad wasn't a day over 17. No air raid since the push start. September 7th. Still very busy. We're having awfully heavy dressings now. One that I did today almost made me cry, and I don't cry easily either. The lad was a Canadian, about 22, with a frightful arm. Elbow joint smashed, and the whole arm stiff and swollen and full of gas gangrene infection. In getting off the dressing, I had to move it some, and though I was as careful as I could be, I could hear the bones crunching and grating inside. Then I had to pull off hard, dry sponges and haul out yards of packing that kept catching on the splintered bone. The lad just turned his head away and never made a sound, didn't even grit his teeth. Once accidentally touching a bare nerve end with my forceps, I hurt him terribly, and he turned his head to see what I was doing. I saw his eyes were full of tears, and the pupils enormously dilated with pain, but not a word from him, no groaning, no please wait a minute, sister. Just patient silence. I choked for an instant, then burst out, "Oh, I'm awfully sorry, lad. I don't want to hurt you." And he said so gently, "It's quite all right, sister. Carry on." When I finished and was talking him in, he looked up at me and said, "You're very gentle, sister. Thank you very much." And I had tortured him unbearably. I couldn't say a single word. October 3rd. Cambria, a city in France taken by the Germans, is taken by the Allies. And the boys are in high spirits. We are getting American wounded by the hundreds now. I got 14 in my ward last night. All the wards are jammed full. November 11th. In the 10 minutes, the war will be over. Hostilities are to be ceased at 11 o'clock, and it's 10 minutes to 11 now. It's incredible that one can measure peace in actual units of time. I lay awake all last night thinking, what are we all to do now? How can we go home to civilian life, to the never-ending, never-varying routine? In the 22nd General Hospital, the vital living thing, saturated with the heights and depths of human emotion, will become a slowly fading memory of days when we really lived. There go the bells and the drums and the sirens and the bagpipes and cheering that swells louder and louder. The war is over, and I never felt so sick in my life. Everything is over, but it shan't be. I won't stop living.